Hello everyone, this is Grant, Developer Evangelist on the OpenShift team at Red Hat. This video goes along with the Mobilize Your MongoDB blog post series, Part 4. In this video I'm going to show you how to download and import the BeerShift mobile application source code into your integrated development environment. The first thing we'll want to do is go to the BeerShift repository on GitHub. So go to github.com/BeerShift. I'll then click on the BeerShift mobile application project and copy the URL that's provided. I'll open up my terminal application, go into my code directory, and then git clone the URL. This will download all of the source code and create a local Git repository for me. Now that my source code is downloaded, let's start up Titanium Studio. I'll select the default workspace. And once the IDE is loaded, we'll want to go to App Explorer and then Import Project. I'll select Existing Titanium Project, select Next, Project Directory, and browse to the source code directory. So I'll click Open on that, and you can see that it should be your home directory code BeerShift. And then I'll click Finish. This will create the project for me. I'll go ahead and close the dashboard. Now we want to set our deployment targets for the application. So I'll double click on the tiapp.xml file. And down at the bottom you can set your deployment targets. Since I'm on the Mac operating system, I do have the iPhone and iPad available. If you're on the Windows or Linux operating systems, you'll probably just have Android available since you can install Xcode on those operating systems. So let's dive into the source code. The first thing we want to look at is localization. If you want to localize your application, and BeerShift is localized, you can create an i18n directory, and underneath that create a 2-digit country code for the locale you're targeting. If we look at the en locale, we should have a strings XML file, which is a name value pair. I also have a German strings XML file and a Chinese string XML file. And we'll get into how these are actually loaded into your application a bit later. I'll go ahead and close down all of the files, and we'll expand the resources directory. Underneath the resources directory, you will have an app.js file. This is the first file that gets loaded when your application is running. It's the bootstrap. So if I click on this, let's just walk through this source code. But before we do that, let me go ahead and start the application running. So I'll run it in the iPhone simulator. It's going to go ahead and compile this down to the native project and then start the iPhone emulator for me. Now that the application is up, let's walk through the source code and I'll explain what's going on here. The first thing I do is I include a dateformat.js file, and we can see that right here. This is just an open source library that will allow me to create human readable date formats for my application. So if we go back to the app.js file, the next thing I do is create a tab group. And this is just the layout that I've decided to use for my application. I want it to be a tab-based application, which is pretty standard for iPhone apps, and it'll create an empty container down here for me. The next thing I do is I define my API host. This is the backend service that we created in a previous blog post. This is pointed to my actual backend, but you'd want to modify this API host to point to your own that you deployed in the previous blog post. I'll then set that as a property for the application, and you can almost think of this as like a plist in the iOS or Objective-C programming language. The next thing I want to do is define our main window where a user can search for beers. So I create a variable, I call it drink window, and it's going to require drink window, and it's going to create a new one, and then I create a tab and I give it the icon of drink, which is this little icon right here, which should be under the images directory over here. You can see that I have all the icons right here. If I click on one of those, you can see that this is the little icon that's being displayed there. I then create my other tabs. I create a drink tab. I create a fire hose window, which is essentially just the keg stand. In the code I call it fire hose. In the actual UI I call it keg stand. And then I create my settings window. And again, all of these icons are under the image directory. One thing you'll notice is I set the title on these tabs to L, and then parentheses, and then a name. L is just a macro, and that's what looks up in our strings.xml file. So if I look for tab settings in the Chinese one, for example, tab settings, here's the key, and here's the value in Chinese. And it'll replace the title with whatever it looked up in the localized files for me. I then add all of these tabs to my tab group, and then I open the tab group, which displays the actual UI for the application. So let's take a quick look at the drinkwindow.js file. So here we do a couple of things. We create a nav bar up at the top, which we can see here, and we give it a name of WinDrink. And so if we look in strings.xml file, even the Chinese one, this should say BeerShift. WinDrink is BeerShift. And that's what gets displayed here because that doesn't actually translate into Chinese. So let's go back to the drink window. We then create our text fields and our input fields. And this is very similar to standard GUI programming. And then I create a table beers, which is going to have the results, and I add that. I set the width and height for the layout. And then we can scroll down and we add an event listener. So just as you may be familiar with Windows Forms programming or Java GUI development, every action that a user can do fires an event. So we need to listen for those events. So I actually listen for the return key, which we set up here when we create the text field for users inputting their beer name. So I'll explain this real quick. Let me open up the emulator again. So what am I drinking? This field right here. First thing we do is we create a text field. We set the width to 95%. We set top to 10. Top is how many pixels down it's going to be from the nav bar. So 10 pixels down. We set a rounded border style, so you can see that here. We then can set CSS style font properties. Font family is Helvetica, font weight is bold. The return key type, you can actually override the return key to say whatever you would like, and here I'm saying set the return key to say search. So if I click on this field, instead of saying return, it's going to say search. I can then set a hint text on this field, and this is just going to look up in my resources files again, and I set it to TF beer name, which is actually translated to what am I drinking. And so when the user starts typing here, that hint text gets replaced. You can also do other cool things like disable auto correction for spelling and things like that. Now I'll click the search button, and then it'll populate the table. So let's scroll back down to our table. So I create a table view. I set the width to 95, the height to 75, top to 25. Again, this is how many pixels down it's going to come. I set my row height to 35, my border radius to 5, and I set my data, which is the table row data, to an empty array that I just declared here. So row height you can mess around with. So let's actually kill the emulator real quick. And let's change this to maybe 55 for the row height and rerun this application. Now this is going to look a little crazy, but this will just show you how you can dynamically change things. And maybe underneath the row of your application, instead of just listing the beer name, you actually want to list the first line of the description in your table as well. And so that would be a reason that you would want a larger row height. So let's search for Bud again. And we can see that my row height is extremely large now, and so I could put other information below it. I don't actually want to do that right now, so let's go ahead and change this back to 35 and run the application again. So then I add my table over to my current window, and then I want to add an event listener, which we were talking about just a few minutes ago, and I'm going to listen for the return key to be pressed. And when the return key is pressed on the keyboard, just like we're doing here, and remember the return key we overrode to say search, but it is still the return event, I'm going to catch that, and then I'm going to perform an anonymous function. This is the callback right here. Instead of providing a function name, I've just declared an anonymous function. So the first thing I want to do is get my API URL, so I'm going to use the host that we set in app.js, and I'm going to append the endpoint for this application, or for the endpoint for searching for beers. I then create a HTTP client, and I call it request. This is a GET request, and I'm passing in this API URL. And so if we go to this API host, So let's do that real quick just to show you how this is working. Let me go back over to apps. Here's my API host. Let me copy that, open up a browser, paste that in, go back to our code real quick, and we can see that I'm appending beer/name, and then I'm adding the e.value, which is actually the event that happened. So this will be what the user actually typed in. So if I go over to my browser and I paste in beer/name and type in bud, this is just a HTTP GET request that's getting returned to the phone, and I can verify that it's working inside of the browser. So I'm going to send that request. Now one thing that's interesting is this send is not a blocking call. Once you call send, it's going to keep executing your code, so we have to set a callback for when the response is received, and we do that by setting the onload to another anonymous function. And what I want to do is create a variable called response, and I'm going to parse the information that was returned back. So basically this information, just returned via REST, HTTP, and I'm going to parse that information. And so JSON.parse actually creates a nice array for me. And then I'm going to loop over each of these, and I'm going to build a table row for each one. So each of these is a table row. So I'm going to say has child true, which is what gives it this nice little arrow to indicate that there's a child window to this. I'm going to set the class name, the background color, and then I'm going to set some hidden fields, underscore title, description, and brewery, that's going to get passed down to the child window. Now I'm going to create a label. This is what actually displays the beer name. So I call titanium.ui create label, give it the text, which is the current row that I'm on, and I get the name element, which is returned with the REST API. So here we can see a name element. This name element is called Bud Dry, and it has a description, and it has a brewery information. So I'm going to set the name element. And you can see that the first one returned in the web was Bud Dry, and the first one we display here is Bud Dry. Bud Dry. Then I set the font. I'm going to set it the font size to 14. I'm going to set it to bold. Left is how far to indent pixel-wise from the left. I chose 50 because I wanted room for this little image here. It's going to come down from the top 10 pixels, and the height is going to be 20 pixels, and I can set the width and color. And then I'm going to add this label to my actual row that I defined, my table row. Now I'm going to create this little image over here on the left-hand side, and this is just an icon image. And so I call it icon image, and I say create image view, pass it the image name, which again is under the image directory. So if I say one of these, probably this one. Nope, wrong one. Let's go back to the code here. Icon beer. It's this one. You can see this little image right here. That's what's actually getting created over here. I set the width and height. Left again is how far to indent pixel-wise from the left and come down 5 pixels from the top. Then I add my icon image to my row, and then I push this row onto my data array. So I'm going to continue to loop through each result that was returned from the JSON response and keep adding rows and pushing it onto my data array. Once I'm done iterating all of those, I then set that data array on my table that I created earlier, and I set that table visible to true. I then add an event listener, a click event, or on your phone if you touch it, that's a click event, and then I'm going to create a detail window. So if I click this event or click that row, it captured that click event and then displayed this next window for me. Okay? So that's basically the code. I'm not going to walk through every piece, but I ran through basically all of the information that you need in order to make sense of the other files and the other source code, other windows and tabs in this application. So the next thing to do for you is to learn the rest of this application and add some new features to it. Maybe make it look a little better. I'm not a UI design expert by any means, so we could make the UI look a little bit better. We could add new features. We could do a lot of things. So once you add new features, or maybe you just want to fix a bug that you find, send me a pull request on GitHub, and I'll get your code merged into the master branch. That's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed the blog post series. I may do a part 5 for the Java backend Would really love to hear some feedback on it via the comments section, or you can follow me on Twitter at @gshipley and send me a tweet and let me know how this went for you. Thanks a lot.